Right now we live in the most connected society in history, and yet we are possibly the most disconnected people from actual community in history. What I mean is we are connected digitally, but we are not physically and emotionally and relationally as connected as we like to think. And this is a huge problem because this digital connection isn't actual connection. It's not a real connection. It's not real community. It's not real relationships. And here's why. Because we keep everyone kind of at arm's length. We keep everyone at a distance in this digital community because what we do is we present to them a curated version of ourselves, a highlight reel of ourselves. It is not really who we are. And so we are not truly known by the people around us. And you cannot have real community if you are not truly known. It seems as though we are scared to actually let people in and actually let people know who we really are. And then the other shoe here is that we don't, in turn, we don't really invest in those around us. We are not really engaged in those around us. Instead, we present some form of content, and then we kind of take their content, if you will, and it's not a mutual sharing. It is simply getting what we can out of each other instead of walking with one another. We seem to be very self-focused. It is what I can get out of this. What matters is my identity. What matters is my preference. What matters are my freedoms, right? It's all about me. And we see this not only in society outside of here, but we see this in the church as well. We come in here and we have it all together, right? And we try to look our best, and we try to present this curated version of our spirituality to those around us because we want to look holy and righteous and pure. And so we present what we want them to see of us, but don't kid yourself. Don't kid yourself. Each one of us has to battle this self-centered mentality. Now, I know that I just jumped directly into the deep end, and you're like, dude, let me catch my breath. I get just stick with me for a minute, because this is actually very important for us, because we cannot have real community until we are willing to be vulnerable, until we are willing to be honest, until we are willing to let people see the real us, and in turn, we are willing to lean into their lives and invest in their lives. That is what real community is knowing them and being known by them. And this is why this matters. This is why this is so important, because we need community. We need relationships. It's not just that we want them, which some of us do, most of us do. I think probably safe to say all of us want relationships, but it's deeper than that. It is within us. It is part of our makeup to need relationships. In Genesis, we have the creation story, right? We have the creation story. We see a list of things that God does, and then he declares what? It is good. And then we come to Genesis 2, chapter 2, verse 18, and the very first time God mentions that something isn't good, he looks at Adam alone and says, it is not good that man is alone. The first thing that God says is not good is that Adam was alone. It's not that there was something wrong with Adam. There was not a problem with Adam. Adam was made perfectly in the image of God. The problem was not that there was something broken within Adam. It's not that there was something wrong with Adam. It was that he was placed in a situation that he could not survive because he was not designed to be alone. He was made in the image of God, our God, in whose image Adam was made, is triune. He has always been in relationship, always been in community, and that is how we were designed, to always be in community, to always be in relationship. To be alone is to be in a situation in which we cannot survive. We need each other. We need community. We need to be known by others. We need to know others and invest in their lives. And that is what we're looking at this morning, is how to live in this gospel community. Paul has been writing through Galatians on what it means to live in the gospel, right? The last chapter and this chapter, 5 and 6, are about the practical gospel, what it looks like in our lives in practice. And here in this section, Paul points out how the gospel works in our community, how to live in this gospel community. And he goes on to explain one of the major things we see in this passage is that the gospel affects those relationships around us. The gospel affects our relationships. Paul begins this whole section in chapter 5, verse 26 with a danger to avoid. There's a danger to avoid here. He makes this statement in verse 26, don't become conceited, right? He says, let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. This word conceit here in the ESV, translated as conceit, is the Greek word isn't as simple as we may like to grasp it. We have it translated here as conceit, and that seems like arrogant, and that's part of it, but that's not the whole thing of it. There's a little more to it. The King James translated it as vain glory, and really what it is that we're putting glory in something that isn't there. We're putting glory in something that isn't there. John Stott described this word as putting value on things that are not valuable. Tim Keller added to that it isn't that we are deceived and we believe that there is value where there isn't. It is that we know there is no value there, and for some reason we still put value there. Deep down, we understand that there is no value there. Deep down, we understand, this is what Paul is warning, is that deep down you know it's not about you. Deep down, you know it's not about your efforts. Deep down, you know it's not about what you can do in your lives. But for some reason, we get tripped up into believing and thinking and feeling and acting as though it is about us. Don't fall into this trap. That's what Paul is warning here about. He's like, don't give into this empty glory. Don't put weight where there is no weight. Don't put undue value on your actions and your efforts and your works and on yourself. Don't begin to live into something that isn't true. It's not a matter of begin to think less of yourself or begin to think that you are worse than you are. That's not what Paul is saying here. It is simply realize that it's not about you at all. That's what Paul is saying here. Realize that it's not about you. It's not about you at all. C.S. Lewis said in Mere Christianity that humility isn't thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. The real problem isn't that you have too high of a view of yourself. It is that your focus is on you. That is our problem, is that it's not that we all think that we are so awesome and so great. It is that we are all thinking about me. And when we see it in connection to verse 25, we should begin to submit all of those desires to him. That's what he means by keep in step with the Spirit. If you remember last week, we saw that this phrase, keep in step with the Spirit, means to be drawn up in a line. It was used in a few different contexts. One was in a military context where they would say they used it to mean to submit in rank and order. Submit in rank and order. Another was used in Hellenistic philosophical circles, meaning to follow someone's principles. What it does is it brings in this idea of discipleship. That word slipped my mind all of a sudden. It brings in this idea of discipleship. It is getting in line with somebody else, submitting to someone else. What Paul is getting at here in this section, in these two verses, is that we are to submit all of ourselves to the Spirit, to begin to be formed and transformed into the image of Christ by the help of the Spirit. Submit all of that to Him. Don't let it be about you. It's not just about you being the best version of you that you can be. It is about you becoming like Him. This conceit or this vain glory, this empty glory is the opposite of that. It is choosing to focus on yourself and your desires and putting weight on you and what you want over Him and what He wants. It's about about focusing on my ability over His ability, my kingdom over His kingdom. And Paul points out two ways. Right here in verse 26, two ways that this self-focus is actually detrimental to our relationships. This self-focus, this self-centered life causes us to feel either superior or inferior. It causes us to be puffed up or to be let down. It causes us to see ourselves as superior or inferior. One problem that we may see in ourselves is that we begin to think that we are better than those around us. We're better than those around us, and we want to prove it. That's what that word provoke means there. It's to call people out, to challenge them, to compete with them, to prove that you are better than them. John Stott said that we can become so sure of our superiority that we want to demonstrate it. We want to prove that we're better than those around us. And that's what Paul is saying here with this word. Let us not become conceited, provoking one another. Let's don't try to prove that we're better than everybody else. Don't think that you are better than everybody else and have to prove it. And then the other problem that we see with this is that we can become inferior. We can see ourselves as less than those around us, that they are better than we are. And what happens in this is we begin to get jealous of them, envying them, right? Don't allow yourself to envy them. We get jealous of their relationship with God. We get jealous of their gifting. We get jealous of how easy the Christian life is to them or how blessed their life seems to be. We get jealous of the opportunities that they have that we don't have. We get jealous of the things that we see in their lives. And we see this play out in a number of ways in our lives, right? Have you ever watched someone and had the thought, I could do that better. I could do that better than them. Or have you ever watched them and thought, I can never do that as good as them? The problem with that is, either one of those, is that what we are doing, instead of just seeing what they are doing for the sake of what they are doing and being happy for them, what we are doing is making their actions about us. I can do that better, or I'm not as good at it. It's not about you. What they're doing is not about you. That is what's happening here, is we can become superior or inferior and make everything about us. Allowing ourselves to be self-centered and self-focused hurts the relationships around us because either side, superiority or inferiority, causes us to live negatively toward those around us. You cannot provoke, you cannot try to prove that you are better than them or show that you're better than them and have a healthy relationship with them. And you cannot envy them and be jealous of them and have a healthy relationship with them. Both sides cause conflict in our relationships. But when we keep in step with the Spirit, when we bring our opinion of ourselves into subjection with Christ, we see ourselves as God sees us in Christ. And we can begin to see them as God sees them in Christ. Tim Keller said that with a gospel view of self, it makes us simultaneously humble and bold. We do not think that we are better than anybody else, and we do not think that we are less than anybody else. We are simply who we are. That is what the gospel does in our relationships, is it begins to help us see that we are who we are and they are who they are, and we all have our unique role and part to play in this whole thing. They are not better than me. They are not worse than me. We are simply here. As we humble ourselves before God, our view of ourselves in light of the gospel, we begin to have an appropriate view of self, an appropriate view of others, and we begin to have these appropriate relationships. And then Paul goes on, right? He gives us the danger to avoid, and then he goes on to what it looks like for us to actually live in gospel community, what it looks like for us to live in gospel community. The first thing that happens in gospel community is that we restore the fallen. We restore the fallen. Verse 1, it tells us that we are to restore anyone who is caught in any transgression. This word caught doesn't simply mean that they were found out. It means that they were surprised by, or to be tripped up by, or to be overcome by. It's this person who has fallen into sin. And Paul says that those of us who are spiritual should restore that brother or sister who has fallen into sin. This word restore means to be put in order, to cause to be in a condition to function well. This same Greek word here in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. This word was used in Ezra 4 about rebuilding walls. It was used in Matthew 4 about mending fishing nets. And it was also used in ancient Greek literature in medical vocabulary in references to setting a fractured or dislocated bone. It is about making things right, bringing things back into order, bringing things back where they should be to function properly. That is what our role as spiritual people is to bring those who have fallen back into a right place, into the place that they can function as though they are supposed to. This doesn't mean that we ignore their sin. This doesn't mean that we ignore sin, ignoring sin, condone sin, and we can't do that either. This restoration is really a reference to church discipline. Restoring somebody is a reference to church discipline. If anyone sins, then you go to them. And then if that doesn't work, then you go with a few people. And if that doesn't work, then you bring it to the church, and the church then talks about it. See, church discipline is something that gets ignored way too often in our current context because it's uncomfortable mostly. It's uncomfortable to do this, but when done properly, church discipline actually accomplishes three goals. It actually does three things for us. It restores a fallen brother or sister. It preserves the church's witness to those around the church in the community. And then it protects us within the church from pervasive sin. It helps to create healthy boundaries. It shows us what is okay and what is not okay. It points out sin and says, hey, you should avoid that. And this is part of what Paul means here at the end of verse 1 when he says, keep watch on yourself lest you be tempted. Make sure that you don't fall too. Make sure that you are aware of your propensity to fall, to sin, and make sure that you, as you are restoring them, that you don't fall into the same temptations, the same traps, the same holes that they're in. Make sure that you restore them, but that you don't fall into that as well. Paul tells us this in 1 Corinthians 10 as well. He says, therefore, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Restore without falling. The reality is that if we are out of touch with the gospel, we will have a hard time restoring those who have fallen. If we are out of touch with the gospel, we will have a hard time restoring those who have fallen because we will more than likely, we will judge them instead of restore them. Are you curious where you are with this? Have you ever noticed in yourself a sense of pleasure that someone was found out? Have you ever noticed that in yourself that you were pleased that they were brought down a peg or two? Of course not. You would never. Have you ever noticed in yourself an anger or frustration toward those who are less mature than you think they are or should be? You see that they keep messing up, and you notice that instead of concern for them, you feel anger and frustration toward them. So we immediately see this as coming from a superiority, and it does at some level. That's clear. That's obvious that if we think that we're better than them, we're going to judge them, we're going to be angry at them. But really, this also comes from inferiority as well. We get angry at them for exhibiting the same things that we hate about ourselves, right? That's one of the biggest things we notice about ourselves with our kids. We get so frustrated at the things that our kids do that we hate about ourselves, right? We could get jealous of things going well and then rejoice when they aren't, right? We can get jealous that things seem to be going so well for them, and I wish I could be like them. I wish I could do that. That's just so whatever. And then when it's not, we're like, oh, yes. We need to learn how to restore with a spirit of gentleness. Paul tells us that we are to gently restore people, not shame them, not write them off, not celebrate them, but restore them in a spirit of gentleness. Living in a gospel community gets messy. Next, we see that we are to bear one another's burdens. These burdens are weights or troubles or stresses or hurts or pains. We're to bear one another's burdens. Friends, every one of us carries around things that the people around us know nothing about at all. We all struggle. We all hurt. We all have things in our lives that we can't really bear alone, and nobody else around us even has an idea that we are facing it. Peter tells us that we are to cast those cares upon Christ because he cares for you. He wants to bear that with you. Jesus himself said, bring all of those to me and take my yoke upon you. I want to walk with you in that. But then Paul adds to all of this and says, yes, bring it to Christ, but also you help the people around you. You walk beside them. You bear their burdens with them. Martin Luther said that Christians must have strong shoulders and mighty bones so that we can carry our brother's weaknesses. We are to carry the weights that they are carrying. This is part of being in a gospel community, bearing one another's burdens. In 1 Corinthians 12, which we read earlier, Paul lays out what true gospel community looks like. He describes it like like a human body. Every part is necessary. Every part is necessary. I need both eyes. I need both feet. Both feet need all 10 toes. Likewise, we need each other for us to function properly. Romans 12 tells us to rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. And he says, live in harmony with one another. We are to live in harmony. We're to fill in the gaps for each other. I'm to fill in the gaps for you, and you are to fill in the gaps for me. We are to be together and walk together in harmony, helping each other. We are to carry each other's burdens. We are to bear the weight of those things that the ones around us cannot bear alone. That is why we need community. Paul says that living this way, in this gospel community, fulfills the law of Christ. Fulfills the law of Christ. Now, the use of law here brings their minds back to the false teachers where they were talking about fulfilling the law of Moses. And so Paul is trying to reframe this whole idea of living and fulfilling the law, where he's like, no, it's not about the law of Moses, it's about the law of Christ. It's not about fulfilling these laws that you see in the Old Testament. It's about fulfilling that which Christ commands us. So what is the law of Christ? It appears that to Paul, the law of Christ is all of his ethical teachings manifested in his actions toward people. In other words, the law of Christ is doing what Jesus taught and living how Jesus lived. In John 13 and then in John 15, we see Jesus introduce a new command. His new commandment, which he says is that we love one another. In fact, this is how the people around you are going to know that you're mine, is how well you love one another. The law of Christ is the law of love. And when believers bear one another's burdens, we obey the commands of Christ and we behave as Christ did, and thus we fulfill his law. Verse 3 shows us what happens if we are out of touch with the gospel. If we are out of touch with the gospel, he says, if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. When we don't live into the gospel, when we don't live through the gospel, when we don't view ourselves and those around us through the lens of the gospel, we begin to think that helping them is somehow beneath us. That helping them, bearing their burdens, carrying that for them and with them is somehow beneath us. We need to humble ourselves and be willing to step into their hurts and their pains and take the weight of their struggles with them. And that's what a gospel community does. Whether you like it or not, whether you want to believe it or not, at some point you will be on the other end of that needs help. It's like the old hymn says, lean on me when you're not strong. I'll be your friend. I'll help you carry on. For it won't be long till I'm gonna need somebody to lean on. It's hard to read that without singing it. But we need each other. There will be a point when I need somebody that I can lean on as well. We need to help when we are needed, help when those around us are carrying a load that is too heavy for them, bear their burdens with them so that we can help them and know that at some point, you're going to need them to help you as well. I promise you that. And finally, Paul gives us a final charge for living in a gospel community, living in a gospel community. He says to restore the fallen, to bear one another's burdens, and then he reminds them and reminds us that we have to carry our own load. We have to carry our own load. Verse 4, he says, but let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor, for each one will have to bear his own load. This bearing your own load is different than bearing your own burdens. This is looking forward, actually, to the second coming of Christ, which will usher in a distinctive judgment for believers. This judgment is not for the purpose of salvation, whether or not you can get into heaven, but this is about the fact that we as believers will be judged for what we did with our lives on this earth from salvation until heaven. That we will stand before God and have to give an account for how we lived our lives on this earth as part of His kingdom. One day we're going to stand before God, and He's going to look back out. He's going to look back over our lives, and we're going to see how we lived in His kingdom and His mission. Jesus said in Matthew 12 that each one of us is going to give an account for every idle word. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3 that each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. Paul says, test your work. Here in Galatians 6, he says, test your work, prove your work through fire. Make sure that you are living as you should, because you can only stand on your works in that moment of judgment. God's not going to look at you and say, okay, let's see how John did. Let's see how Grace Church did. No, He's going to look at you and say, how did you do? How was your life lived? Make sure that you are living as you should, that you are living in the kingdom as you should, living the mission of God as you should, living in the gospel as you should, because one day, believer, one day you are going to stand before God and have to give an account for how well you lived. Again, this is not about getting into heaven. This is for believers. You're already going to heaven, but how well did you live? We are not called to freedom, to be lazy, but to keep in step with the Spirit, to submit to Him and be about His kingdom and His mission. We don't like to think of it like that, right? There's a part of us at least that feels like, oh, this is legalistic. Let's back up. Let's slow down. No, this is not. This is just the Bible. At some point, you're going to stand before God and have to give an account for how you lived your life from the moment you were saved until the moment you get to heaven. What have you done with your life? What are you doing with your life? Are you living as part of the gospel community that we are called to live? Are you living in this kingdom of God? Are you fulfilling the law of Christ that we are called to fulfill? That word there, it doesn't just mean that if we do this, then we do this. It means too, you should do this so that you will fulfill. There's part of this is a command to fulfill the law of Christ. It's not just that it's a happy effect of doing this. No, that this is the command is to fulfill the law of Christ. Are you fulfilling the law of Christ? Are you restoring those around you who have fallen? Are you bearing one another's burdens? Are you submitting to His authority and to His kingdom? Are you submitting your desires and your work and your will to His? One day, friends, we're going to stand before God and give an account for everything that we've done. How is that going to go? What is that going to look like for you? You will not be able to say, well, this is what my mom and dad did. This is what my grandparents did. What did you do? How are you living? Is it part of the gospel community? Are you functioning in this way that we are called as believers to function? Is that we are part of this gospel community? The big problem that we see in our society is that we withdraw, and that happens in the church too, because our spiritual growth is primarily, right? Our spiritual walk is primarily my private time with God. When I'm praying, when I'm reading Scripture, when I am alone with God, that is how I judge how I'm doing spiritually. And that is not really all that there is. How are we living in this gospel community? How are you living in this gospel community? You will have to carry your own load. You will have to present that to God one day. What will that look like?